Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. This is the 10th session on experiencing theosis with the Philokalia, and we're looking at Evagrius the Solitary, also called Evagrius Ponticus, born in 345, died in 399, and his specialty was prayer and contemplation of God. We'll move on to the next page here, and we're going to do a little bit of reading. The thing about Evagrius is you've got a well-educated man in his era. He does some civil work. He joins a monastery and then leaves the monastery to go and live in a place in Egypt that is now long forgotten except for ruins, which is on the right-hand side of the highway as you're going from Cairo up to Alexandria, and it's called Kelia, or cells, a vast area of land where St. Anthony recommended people to go to once they had outgrown monastic life and they wanted to live alone. Now, the purpose of this is I'm not expecting any of you will necessarily have such a hermit life, and certainly not the asceticism that was involved in it. But I thought it a very apt point of this particular series to get a taste for where these early desert fathers were coming from. And there are really two positions. One is that they were driven out because of imperial persecution from Rome. And the second one is that they did it voluntarily. They were spiritually hungry for a greater proximity to God and no interruption in their day. And we just sang this morning about Ambibola, who is by Pope Athanasius, the first Christian hermit recognized by a papacy and thereby made a vocation in Christ. And so as we see the church development over the centuries, we see papacy, as papacy was common and joined in those days, and acknowledged as the head of the different Christian sees. Each of them had a patriarch or a pope. The idea of one pope, such as the Roman Catholics later ordained among themselves as being the head of all the popes, was an outrageous and ostentatious kind of a concept and never eventuated among the sees themselves. So the patriarch of each of these sees would contribute to the spiritual development of Christianity around the world. Evagrius has come to this place. He didn't come into Egypt to another monastery. He came into the Kelia, into the cells, which are cells are not prison cells. They're basically caves or hermitages. And no person can hear another person's voice. No person can interrupt another person. So it takes a vast area for a couple of thousand men to live like that, and probably some women were there as well. And this was before the days of the Arab invasion, of course, so it was pretty much catch and kill your own. You had to beware of any lions or bears or snakes and things like that, scorpions that are out there in the desert in those days. But politically, it was a relatively safe place to be, or an undisturbed place to be, a non-violent place to be. So I want to read a few things to you to let you know, or might have you read them, to let you know the atmosphere of closeness with God that these early seekers of God's theosis were like, what they experienced, how they went about it. Obviously, this is just one character, but there are many other fathers and mothers like them, most of them undocumented, but those that are documented tend to be following this line of thought. And with solitude came an ever-increasing demand of rejection of the body's sleep, the body's appetites, the body's need for physical comfort in every way. Now, this still goes on today. There are people who do this. But in the civilized spiritual world of seeking theosis, this tends to be transcended, and a person is again brought into the world or brought into the use of material things to keep the body healthy, for example. Now, like this fellow lived for like less than 50 years, 54 years or something like that he lived, so less than 60 years, and probably beating down his body in the process. So the point of having a look at Evagrius is not only to have a look at where he lived and why he lived there, and secondly, that he had a genius for his intimacy with God that provided intimate know-how for any person on earth to come into theosis. And we've seen a little bit of that in St. John Climacus' teachings on the ladder of divine ascent. Evagrius had the same, if not more pronounced, clarity about the human journey. So with effective education and then effective solitude and effective monastic experience, God was able to build up in the man an intimate pathway knowledge and the intelligence to convey that, to write it down, to pass it on to people. And so we have in the Philokalia, we have a couple of pages of his stuff, maybe, I don't know, 20 pages, 30 pages. And primarily, the one of interest to us is on prayer. What are the principles that he speaks about on prayer? And prayer being not how many different ways can you say the Lord's Prayer. Prayer is being with God and what happens with you when you're with God. What do you say? What are you feeling? What's the absorption rate? What's the intimacy? And in the case of theosis, for example, how is it that the two of you become one-mindedness and that you and God are able to be human and divine without a seam? So you cannot tell which part of you is God and which part of you is human any longer. And presumably, God's got a similar kind of experience going on. So I want to read you a couple of things from that, and I'll read you something from this little book here, The Desert Fathers, which recently came into our possession. It's an older book. So maybe, Krista, would you read the first page here for us, please, if you can see that okay. He possessed to an exceptional degree. If you're speaking, you're muted. Okay, you can't. Guido, would you have a go at this, please?
Yes, I will. He possessed to an exceptional degree the gifts of psychological insight and vivid description, together with the ability to analyze and define with remarkable precision the various stages on the spiritual way. Evagrius' development of a theology of contemplative prayer and asceticism laid the groundwork for a tradition of spiritual life in both Eastern and Western churches. Evagrius is noted for the theoretical speculation he espoused that were drawn in a large part from the writings of Origen of Alexandria, many of which were deemed heretical, such as reincarnation and his teachings on the practicality of union with God. First comes the learning and then the distilling. You may find yourself that your theories and your practicalities on spirituality are two different fueled and understood realities.
So the point of this page here is to mention first off that Evagrius was very interested in, and very much influenced by the writer Origen in Alexandria. And if you go and do theology at university, you'll always come across studies in church history of Origen, who is a profound thinker and organizer, and he is the reason that Christianity today includes the Old Testament, for example, the Jewish covenant. There was considerable activity in the days before Origen and leading up to Origen in the 2nd century that said, well, why do we need the Jews? We've got Christ. You know, why do we want to keep a record of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of this stuff? And Origen was the fellow who pointed out the value of seeing Christ, the Son of God, acting in the development of the Jews. And so it gave Christianity a deeper, richer knowledge of who Jesus was and why he was who he was. And so the roots of the Son of God and the Son of God's preparation for becoming the Son of Man were then included in the 4 Gospels, notably the 4 Gospels of Jesus and the writings of Paul and various other writings that were in the names of the apostles and were trying to be counted as original. So this is the first thing. Evagrius was very, very influenced by his writings. And as a result of that, you didn't tend to see Origen's practical experience of that. You only got his theories, his ideas about how things might have worked or might work. And as with an educated person, you also get their theories of how things work. I found in my own life, and I'd like to impart this over to you as well for your discovery, I found in my own life that my theories basically were rubbish and they didn't amount to anything. And it was a whole lot more comfortable in my spiritual walk to look to other people's theories. And in looking to other people's theories, you know, the actual philosophical content and the materialistic, matter-of-fact content of what makes up my spirituality, I found that there were other men and women far more gifted than me who had put together ideas that when I took those ideas and tested them through the will of God, God's will aligned itself far better with their ideas than with mine. So my ideas went out the window. And you'll find in my teachings, I'm looking to other people's theories and their explanations for things. And I'm pretty sure that by the time Evagrius went and moved into the Egyptian cells in the Kelia, in that district, and took himself a hermitage there, took himself a place, as a cave there to be alone, he had come to the point of dropping all of his own theories and now wanting to depend purely upon the interaction within himself and God. And this is the development that we see in spiritual life. Theoretically, in spiritual life, we grow up as kids, we get educated, we might do a job of work in some way, or we might be employed by someone, or we might be an employer. We might have a family. And sooner or later, we might find that the spirituality within ourselves is calling us to be more religious than we originally thought we might be. And we start going to church more, or temple more, or mosque more, or whatever our faith is. We might start linking into that church of our upbringing more than we did before. And we find that the worldly experience makes us outgrow many of the theories and the principles even of the church as they no longer apply to us. We're looking for a deeper explanation of our walk in Christ. And we're looking also for things to do in Christ. We want to exercise the power of Christ, be it healing power or prophetic power or insight power or just wisdom power. We're wanting more from God, and that wanting more from God, eventually, if left unto its own course, left to God's course, without the ego getting in the way and trying to steer it left, right, and center, will draw a person into more solitude. And a person will now start to find that instead of feeding off scriptures and feeding off the writings of others, the person is now more interested in, and it's a more effective spiritual life for the person to feed off the movement of relationship internally. And so the internal life now with God, those thoughts, those feelings, that will, that movement, that judgment of God, that assessment of things by God, that now becomes paramount. And when that is happening, a person may be called to the monastic life, but when a person goes to the monastic life, becomes a sister or becomes a monk in the monastic life, what's found is that a person is now conforming to a system of rule, and there are prescribed prayers, and there are prescribed times for doing the spiritual life. And whilst that can deepen a person's life, eventually, for many people, eventually the call away from serving other and being with other people starts to happen, and the person, and in Coptic Church, for example, I imagine it's the same for the Eastern Orthodox churches, there is a process of withdrawal, and you don't see this so much in the Western Church. And if you went into a local church, there's no one ever going to really stand up at the pulpit and say, now for all you potential hermits there, I've got this word of advice from God for you. You don't hear that. But in the Eastern churches, you do. Oriental churches and the Eastern Oriental, you do. And in something like the Ethiopian church, it's basically expected that sooner or later, one of the kids in the family is going to want to become more isolated in God like this. And so Evagrius has moved through this movement of knowing secular life, of knowing monastic life, and now wanting to move into solitary life. And solitary life still requires, not only is there a progression into it, a training to be prepared for it, but there's a need, an ongoing need for a while, to have a mentor, to have someone who can speak into the questions that arise for you. Now, in saying this, I'm saying to you, and you might be listening to this after the fact of this recording and not know me or know the monastery or anything like that, but you just picked up this recording. It might not be that you have got a destiny for being a hermit. You might be satisfied with the measure of spirituality that's happening in your life. However, if you listen to Evagrius, you'll hear the depth that a person can go into in order to find a perfect union with God. The question that came across my life was, so you've got perfect union with God, then what? And the then what brought me out into the world and brought me into drug users and being a help to people who had the worst conditions in their life, in a sense, the condition of addiction and the hopelessness and the death at the end of the trail of that addiction, heroin users and speed users and alcoholics and pill takers who were addicted in that way. And so now the spirit of union with God was brought into the practicality of being useful to other people. How did that happen? And I found that in the course of working in that capacity, union with God now expanded itself. It grew. It had the experience of human suffering now to work with. And it didn't run away from it. It sought real answers for people with real value. And that brought me to the position of realizing that it doesn't matter how much wisdom you've got as someone who's familiar with theosis and union with God, sooner or later you're going to have to yield that and offer it up to the Son of God, to Christ, to the Father, to the Holy Spirit, where a greater power is able to come in and do the work that you want done and that the person you're with wants done. And that's what led me into a deeper Christian life. And that led to evangelizing around the world from a position of theosis, teaching theosis to people living in the world. Now, Evagrius is at this point where he's given up the learning process and he's gone off into the desert. And then his outreach from the desert is his writing about from his psychological, as this paper says here, the psychological insight and vivid description, and his ability to analyze and define with remarkable precision the various stages on the spiritual way. It's a really valuable thing to have a map of the stages of the spiritual journey. And a person really won't become interested in those until having self-explored a considerable amount of spirituality. Suck it and see, let's dive in and see where this takes me kind of thing. And after discovering that it's cute, it's lovely, it's no longer satisfying though, the person's intelligence will have been spiritualized. And with a spiritualized intelligence, the person now wants to get in order the track record of where they've been and therefore where they might be going. And at that point, somebody like Evagrius's work or the Ladder of Divine Ascent becomes an interesting document, and they become interesting people. So the starting point of Evagrius for me is this last paragraph. You may find yourself that your theories and your practicalities on spirituality are two differently fueled and understood realities. What are you doing to put your ideas together? And what are you actually doing in your life spiritually? And do they match? And when you come to Evagrius, you'll find that he's thrown out the bulk of his leaning on the theories. And he's now creating new theories, very personalized theories from the interior life, which are the practicalities of what's actually going on for him. And as you start to study or draw from, feed from people who are speaking on theosis from a deified position in their life, you'll discover that the nourishing thing is that they are showing you practicalities. And the thing you are trying to distill out of your life are all the theories, because the theories you realize aren't satisfying you at all. Let's have a look at the next page. Are you verbal now, Krista? No? Okay. Stephanie, could you have a read of this for us, please? A disciple of the Cappadocian Fathers.
A disciple of the Cappadocian Fathers, he was ordained reader by the Saint Basil the Great, and the deacon by Saint Georgi the theologian, Georgi from Narsissus, and he accompanied the letter to the Council of Constantinople in 381. The Second Ecumenical Council. Evagrius was never ordained priest. After a brief stay in Jerusalem, he went in 383 to Egypt, where he spent the remaining 16 years of his life. After 2 years at Nitria, where he became a monk, he moved to the more remote desert of Philokalia, dying there in 399. While in Egypt, he had as his spiritual father the priest of Perea, St. Macarius of Alexandria, and it is probably that he also knew St. Macarius the Egyptian, the priest and the spiritual father of the sects. In the person of these two saints, he came into the contact with the first generation of the Devil's fathers, and with their, I can't see anything more there.
In their spirituality in its purest form. So of note, this page here tells us that he's been nurtured spiritually by a couple of spiritual giants of his day, people with actual spiritual and church authority. And then he goes off into Egypt and he joins a monastery in the belt of monasteries that were there at the time, probably in the St. Macarius monastery area, which is on the western side of the highway from Cairo to Alexandria. And then after a couple of years there, he feels called to go over to the Philokalia, to the cells, and find himself a place to live as a hermit. It's known that he is a friend of St. Macarius the Great, St. Macarius of Alexandria. And Macarius of Alexandria is a man whose theosis, whose deification with God, has led him also into the gift of miracles. And he's known to be a wonder worker. He's known to be able to cause all manner of help to people and animals. There's a lovely story of a hyena coming to him with a cub who is ill, sick, and he's out in the desert, out actually where now my friend Zachariah is a monk in exactly the same area. There's about 150 monks out there in absolute wilderness desert. And I've been to his cave there, this St. Macarius of Alexandria, where he was at that place. And so this hyena came to him with this little cub that was crook, and Macarius healed the cub and sent them on their way. And the next day, the hyena came back dragging a bear skin or a sheepskin, something like this, as a gift to Macarius of Alexandria. Obviously figured that this was the highest thing of value to the hyena. So there's, his life is filled with extraordinary events. He's a man of the world. He's a man of nature. He's a man of God. And Evagrius is a friend of his and knows him because of time spent out there at Philokalia. St. Macarius, the Egyptian, is the father of monasticism in the sense that the monks under Macarius were hermits but living under a monastic rule, and he had been sent there by St. Anthony down in the southeast. And so Macarius went up there to create a monastery. Now his story is interesting, is that he was brought by an angel to a piece of land, and the angel pretty much spread out its wings like this and said, "Look around you, as far as you can see, I give this to you for the sake of creating a monastery for Christ." And that was essentially, it's been limited right down now, but it's still a pretty big area. I've stayed there in that place. And his old cave is still there, for example. And he's now attracting men to him, and I imagine a few women to him would have come also, women, desert mothers would have come to him, and they would have lived in caves, or they did live in caves. There was no monastic building as such for centuries. But they were living a monastic rule. In other words, they would say certain prayers at certain times. They would join together once a week on Saturday night for common prayer, and then have a Holy Communion, and then go back to their week alone. Whereas over the road and off in the desert there was no such joining like this. But Macarius, being a priest, given into the priesthood by St. Anthony, would come across there and probably celebrate priestly things like a Holy Communion once a year or something like that. So let's have a look at the next page. Rini, would you like to read this next page?
His disciple, St. John Cassian, while abandoning the suspect theories that Evagrius derived from Origen, transmitted the practical aspect of Evagrius's teachings to the Latin West. In the Greek East, the technical vocabulary devised by Evagrius remained thereafter standard. It can be found, for example, in the writings of St. Diadochus of Photiki, St. John Climacus, and St. Maximus the Confessor, as also within the Syriac tradition in the mystic treatise of St. Isaac of Nineveh.
Next page, please. Evagrius makes plain the advantage of total world renunciation and the privilege it opens to the person who seeks entrance into union with God and the sustained fruit of that blessed reality. To this end, it is worth studying the nature of the Kalia desert life of the early desert fathers who lived outside the monastery system that was being formed in their day of the 4th century AD. It was abandoned after the Arab invasion of the 7th century, and for the Copts, the monastic system provided modest security for the ensuing generations of monks and nuns. However, Mata el-Miskin, Matthew the Poor, left monastic life to live in the abandoned wilderness setting of St. Macarius of Alexandria at Wadi el-Riyan, 3 hours' drive southwest from Cairo, and 30-plus monks joined him and formed another kind of Kalia community, and he did this about 30 years ago. And the community that still abides there came from the inspiration of Matthew the Poor to come into the place where St. Macarius of Alexandria was, and the style that Matthew the Poor wanted to live was exactly the hermit style of the Kalia. And this is what people loved about him, and this is what other people despised about him, that he was now a rebellious kind of a guy. Well, he wasn't actually. He was trying to have the spirituality that Evagrius himself and St. Macarius of Alexandria had experienced. He wanted that spirituality. Next page, please. So I've given you a map here. You might have to peer if you're looking at this on your phone. I've given you a map here to show you, this is just taken off the net, I didn't do it, to show you where the cells are. If you have a look where the little blue lakes are, they tend to be the group of monasteries, the thick black line going up from right-hand side to the top of the page is the highway from Cairo to Alexandria, and that would have been in place, not as a tar-sealed highway, of course, but that would have been the road from Cairo to Alexandria in their day. The lakes there are the Wadis, El Natroon area, and at the bottom right, the last little dot there, you see Deir Abu Makar. That's St. Macarius Monastery, where St. Macarius of Egypt lived. And off to the right-hand side, that oblong I've got there pretty much forms the huge area of the cells. It's not just a square box pointing to the Kalia cells. It's actually forget the black arrow that's there. That belongs to the map itself. But that oblong refers to the huge area that was occupied by men and probably some women who went there. And then up from there, the second lake, if you come directly out from the second lake, you've got there, and the Bishoy Monastery. If you come up here to the little lake, which is down a little bit out from the string of lakes, you'll see there you've got Deir Baramus and Suriali, a Surial monastery. And these are the primary monasteries that still exist today, the 4 monasteries in El Natroon. And so you can see that there is on the south side of the highway, there is a string of monasteries there, and that string of monasteries went clear on up the Nile way, way deep into Egypt, like way, way, way deep. And it was filled with people who were seeking the monastic life. And after they had been in the monastic life for a while and wanted to be hermits, some of them would come into the desert away from those monasteries, and some of them would come into the Kelia and live in that area there among hermits. So it's a very practical spirituality. It's got real history. It's real people's lives. You know, some little boy, little girl grew up with a sense of, oh, gee, isn't God lovely? And by the age of 20, 30, 40, 50, they were living in the Kelia cells because God had drawn them in their interior lives into the desire for intimacy, and nothing else satisfied them any longer. They didn't want to be engaged with people. They didn't want a career, a profession. They didn't want the rules of government. They wanted to live the rules of God. End of story. Can I have the next page, please? And here's a map of the area ranging from Saudi Arabia and Jordan right across to the outskirts of Egypt. And you can see roughly the area there where the Kelia were. And Wadi El Rayyan is where my friend Zachariah, and I've got a few friends there, Zachariah live, and I've been out there and stayed there. And to give you the idea of where Matthew de Poor went to, in a sense, replicating the Kelia in the 1970s, I think he went out there from a monastery near Beni Suef, which is to the right of Wadi El Rayyan. So that's just a little bit of history of the factuality of things. Next page, please. The asceticism of the Desert Fathers, according to St. Macarius of Egypt. Now, this is to give you an idea of the intensity of life that these people were living, based on the fact that having commercial enterprise was really not a big feature of their life. Many of them did make coin by producing leather crosses and weaving flax together and stuff like that. And it was necessary, as St. Anthony recognized, it was necessary to have some sort of activity to help you to be alone, that you couldn't just be alone and pray. It just didn't work. So this is a writing by Evagrius, the solitary. Once I visited St. Macarius at noon. This is the priest, the bloke who's just over the road in a sense. Once I visited St. Macarius at noon, and burning with intense thirst, I asked for a drink of water. But he said to me, "Be satisfied with the shade, for at this moment there are many travellers who lack even that." Then, as I was telling him of my difficulties in practicing self-restraint, he said, "Take heart, my son, for during the whole of 20 years I myself have never had my fill of bread, water, or sleep. But I have carefully measured my bread and water and snatched some sleep by leaning a little against the wall." So this is the bloke who's the mentor for the people and the priest for people in the Kelia. So you can understand it. It takes not only considerable conviction to go and live that kind of a life in those days, and it's not a cherished ideal today. People tend to have outgrown the whole quest for theosis, and it's become far more civilized. But in those days, defeating the body and the body's passions because of the separation from God that the body produces for a person, that was the task. Let's have a look at the next page. This is it. Parallel opportunities for participation in a country's community with total renunciation of the world these days is probably only seen in India. I'll say it again. Parallel opportunities for participation in a country's community with total renunciation of the world these days is probably only seen in India. Asrama is a system of stages of life discussed in Hindu texts of the ancient and medieval eras. The 4 asramas these are stages in your life. First you are a student, then you are a householder, then you are a forest walker or forest dweller, and then you are a renunciate. The asrama system is one facet of the Dharma concept in Hinduism, the truth in Hinduism. Tibetans brought their culture of extreme renunciation with them. Hindus have an age-old tradition of these 4 stages of life. Now, I'm saying this to help you understand what's happened for you in your life. I learned my approach to renunciation from the Indian and Tibetan examples from 22 to 32 years old. From which sources have you learned your style? Now, there's a renunciation inside of you, and it might be simmering or it might be predominant, but you couldn't possibly be getting anything out of the study of theosis without God having built in you a kind of renunciation that works for you, for your family structure, for your education, for your upbringing. And the first one of these that stands out is, at what point did you make a radical decision to jump away from the trajectory of your life to follow something spiritual? And for me, that was leaving the Navy at the age of 20 to find God. What did you do? You will have done something. And this is the equivalent of Evagrius going off to a monastery, which then got deepened by Evagrius going off to Egypt and living in an Egyptian monastery, and then Evagrius going off and living in a solitary environment. What did you do? Because if you write that question down and spend today or tomorrow simply examining what were these stages in your life whereby God has moved you in such a way that your life has changed. You've changed demographically, you've changed your character, you've changed the things that you've pursued, you've changed your interests, and you've changed the people that you came to meet and know and befriend, and they befriended you. And some of them you will have rejected because they maybe weren't spiritual enough, and some of them you befriended for a while because you were learning something from them, or you were journeying with them in the same trajectory. But you have had renunciation of the world elements that have happened in your life, and they may have come to you because of the stories of the saints. And the church's value, one of the church's great values, is keeping the stories of the saints alive, real and imagined stories of the saints alive, because God uses them inside your life to help you make decisions. And once you've made those decisions and got yourself into a position where you say, yeah, my life's all about God, you'll then find that you will have inside your life a few typical positions that you stand on, and God then starts leading you in the direction of those positions. You can't have Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and a little bit of dope smoking on the side and expect that God's going to keep you trying to mix all of those together. Sooner or later, you're going to find yourself rejecting or toning down many of those for something that's really important for you. And it will be based upon your renunciation of the world for God and how you have distilled that over the years. And this is a really valuable thing to recognize in yourself for clarity of mind about your own spiritual integrity and where you're also heading in your spirituality. And there isn't anything else in your spiritual life that's going to give you the same quality of clarity about what you yourself have done and how God has activated that, inspired that within yourself. Now, there's a next portion here is to know the heart of Evagrius, a reading from the Desert Fathers by Helen Waddell, 1936. She wrote this or pulled this together, and it's in pages 53 to 57. And we've got 10 minutes left. I think I might put this up on our webpage just as a reading for you to listen to at some point. It's the most beautiful thing. In fact, I am going to read it because it gives you an idea of what it's like in the world for those people who left the world and entered into the Kelia, and you'll feel the love that's in their hearts, and you'll notice that you've probably got the same kind of love being developed in you by God, where it's no longer your Pentecostal works, it's no longer your monastic works, it's no longer your church works, it's no longer your social works, it's no longer your work as a psychologist. You're now in a position in yourself where God is able to focus your life on theosis, on this union with God. And everything inside of yourself will resonate with that. And the more you hear stories about that, the more you can identify it in yourself and say, oh yeah, that's exactly what's happening for me. And in this, you come to know yourself. And as you come to know yourself, you come to know yourself in God, and you also come to know God's activities, God's energies in your life. And this is the fulcrum of spiritual growth. This is how spiritual growth finds itself. We know about ourselves in God, and we know God's activities in us. So here it goes. I'm on page 53 on this beautiful little book. I'll just show you the cover of it here. So it's by Helen Waddell, and it's called The Desert Fathers, Translations from the Latin by Helen Waddell with an introduction. So on page 53, beyond this Mount Nitria, there is another place, and that's where the monasteries are. There is another place in the inner desert, about 9 miles distant, and this place, by reason of the multitude of cells dispersed through the desert, they call Kelia, the cells. To this place, those who have had their first initiation and who desire to live a remoter life, stripped of all its trappings, withdraw themselves, for the desert is vast, and the cells are sundered from one another by so wide a space that none is in sight of his neighbour, nor can any voice be heard. One by one they abide in their cells, a mighty silence and a great quiet among them. Only on the Saturday and the Sunday do they come together to church, and there they see each other face to face as folk restored in heaven. If by chance anyone is missing in that gathering, straight away they understand that he has been detained by some unevenness of his body, and they all go to visit him, not indeed all of them together, but at different times, and each carrying with him whatever he may have by him at home that might seem grateful to the sick. But for no other cause dare any disturb the silence of his neighbour, unless perchance to strengthen by a good word, or, as it might be, to anoint with the comfort of counsel the athletes set for the struggle. Many of them go 3 or 4 miles to church, and the distance dividing one cell from another is no less great. But so great is the love that is in them, and by so strong affection are they bound towards one another and towards all brethren, that they be an example and a wonder to all. So that if any one by chance should desire to dwell with them, as soon as they perceive it, each man offers his own cell. We saw a certain venerable father among them, Ammon by name, a man in whom God had brought together the whole plenitude of his grace. When you saw the charity that was in him, you would say that you had nowhere seen the like. But if you considered his humility, you would judge that in this gift he was by far more potent than the rest. And again, if it were his patience, or his gentleness, or his benignity, you would judge that in these virtues, one by one, he so excelled that you knew not which to put foremost. The gift of wisdom and learning was given him by God in such measure that you would well nigh believe none of all the fathers had gone so far into the courts of all knowledge, and all that saw him confessed that no one had been so received into the secret chamber of the wisdom of God. So then we saw this man of God in his cell with a wall about it. A cell is easily built in those parts, ample enough with rough bricks. He had all that was necessary within, and had himself digged a well. And there came a certain brother, anxious to be near him for his soul's health, and he went to Ammon to ask if there were a small cell vacant anywhere in which he might live. Then he said, I shall make inquiry, but until I find one, do stay here in this hermitage. I go out even now to see to it. And leaving him with all he had, as well as the hermitage, he found himself a poor cell some distance away, and settled himself in it, and gave up his entire hermitage and all that was in it to the unwitting brother. But if it happened that there were many that came anxious to be saved, the old man would bring the brethren together, all eager in helping, and build a hermitage in one day. And when one by one the number of cells was complete, those who were to dwell in them were invited to the church under colour of making a feast, and when they were busied within, each of the brethren would bring from his cell such things as were necessary, and furnish the new cells one by one, so that by this community of charity no utensil or aught that one needs for victuals was wanting, and yet no one knew whose might be the gift. And so on their return at evening, those for whom the cells were prepared found them furnished with all that was needful, and the habitation so provided that they could see no lack. Certain of the fathers who were there told us that in those parts had shone the two Macari like the lights of heaven. These are two persons, two Macariuses, of whom one was an Egyptian by race and the disciple of the blessed Anthony, the other of Alexandria. And even as they accorded in the sound of their name, so did they also in the powers of the soul and the magnificence of their heavenly graces. Each of the two was Macarius, each equally valiant in abstinence of powers of the soul, the one excelling the other in this, only that he owned, as it were by inheritance, the grace and goodness of the blessed Anthony. In other words, to say, Anthony Macarius, who created the monasteries, was Egyptian, not of Alexandria, but of the lower part of, or the upper part of Egypt, and he was a disciple of St. Anthony, whereas Macarius of Alexandria was not a disciple of Anthony. He was his own man. And then they told of him that at one time in the neighbouring countryside a murder had been committed and the crime fastened upon an innocent man, and he who was thus under calumny fled for refuge to his cell, and thither came also his persecutors, accusing him and declaring that they themselves were in peril unless they seized the murderer and delivered him over to the law. But he on whom the crime was fastened swore on the sacraments that he was innocent of this man's blood. And while the contention went on this side and on that, the holy Macarius asked where he was buried that was reported slain. And when they had shown him the place, he set out with all the company that had come to harry the man to the sepulchre. And there upon his knees he invoked the name of Christ and said to those who stood by, Now shall the Lord show if the guilty man is indeed this whom you have accused. And lifting up his voice, he called to the dead man by name. And when he was summoned, answered from the sepulchre, he said to him, I charge you by the faith of Christ, tell us now if it was by this man who bears the blame that you were slain. Then the voice from the grave did clearly answer that it was not by him he had been slain. And in amazement they all fell to the ground, and they rolled at his feet and began begging him to ask the dead man who it was by whom he had been slain. And then he said, I shall not ask this thing. It is enough for me, says Macarius, that the innocent goes free. It is not for me to betray the guilty. The last part of the story is, they said that he, Macarius of Alexandria, was a lover beyond all other men of the desert. He had explored its ultimate and inaccessible wastes. The place in which the holy Macarius lived was called Skeet. It is set in a vast desert, a day and a night's journey from the monasteries of Nitria, and the way to it is to be found or shown by no track and no landmarks of earth, but one journeys by the signs and courses of the stars. Water is hard to find, and when it is found, it is of dire odour, and it might be bituminous, yet inoffensive in taste. Here, therefore, are men made perfect in holiness, for so terrible a spot could be endured by none save those of austere resolve and supreme constancy. Yet their chief concern is the love which they show to one another, and towards such as by chance reach that spot. They tell that once a certain brother brought a bunch of grapes to the holy Macarius, but he who for love's sake thought not on his own things, but on the things of others, carried it to another brother, who seemed more feeble. And the sick man gave thanks to God for the kindness of his brother, but he too, thinking more of his neighbour than himself, brought it to another, and he to another. And so the same bunch of grapes was carried around all the cells, scattering, as it were, far over the desert, and no one knowing who had sent it. It was brought at last to the first giver. But the holy Macarius gave thanks that he had seen in the brethren such abstinence and such loving kindness, and did himself reach after still sterner discipline of the life of the Spirit. When I was in Wadi al-Riyan at Matthew the Poor's monastery, his monastery of hermits, I went out there with Abuna Zachariah, and the first time I stayed there in his cave while he was in the cave, and then the second time I went out there, I was staying out there for a few days, and a monk came to me with Abuna Zachariah. He didn't speak much English, and so Abuna Zachariah translated for him, and he gave me his cave. And he said, here, you can stay here as long as you want. He said, I've got another cave. And I said, no, I can't do that. I can't do that. It's your cave. He said, no. I want to go over to this other cave and fix it up. No, it's my other cave. And so he kind of lied to me to make sure that I had his cave. And the cave was extraordinary. He apologized that the shower wasn't working. But there was gas there if I wanted to cook anything, and it was and it was a cave, and he just outfitted it like this. So here's the same love, where a person is essentially walking away from everything that is in his cave, in the same spirit of this, and that's what I found among these men in the wilderness areas like this. Their exceptional love made them to just drop everything. And if you asked a word from them, they would drop what they were doing and immediately give you their entire attention. If you needed to go somewhere, they would immediately go with you. Immediately, like nothing else mattered than that thing. So anyway, that's a part of my experience. You've probably got that yourself if somebody came to you and said, oh, this is a nice apartment, I'd love to stay here for 5 years. Yes, have it. Yes, I've got another one. I'll go off and live there. This is the spirit that comes from this renunciation. The next point is, we might pick it up next week. So the purposes of showing you Evagrius and the Kilia are to highlight what God's been doing in you as far as your renunciation, because your renunciation of the world and your adoption of God only is the foundation of your theosis. And it doesn't matter what your belief about God is, if you're still hanging on to the world, you'll find that you've got a worldly interpretation of God. And that worldly interpretation of God produces endless arguments and endless problems in the world, both politically as well as religiously. But as soon as a person looks at the world and experiences the world and experiences love for others from the position of renouncing the world, even though you've still got a house and books and literature and electricity and water around you, if your life is based on the renunciation of the world, you'll find that you have got the opportunity given to you by God for your love to lead the way. And that becomes the essential reward. It becomes the thing that you cherish the most. The opportunity to love, and to love freely as God loves, to just pour it out, to do things out of the outpouring of your love, is the great joy of being a human being. And for that, a person has to be separated from the love of the world. At the moment, there is a massive grip on the love of the world worldwide, except for those who are starving and poor and who have always been starving and poor generation after generation, of course. But this massive grip, probably because the fear of being a human being is being touched. The central nerve of fear is being touched and being promoted by politicians and the leaders of human destiny. And the freedom from that is the outpouring of the love of God. And we see it in the saints, we see it in your own life. And you can count, well, you won't be able to count any longer the fullness of the outpouring of love in your life, because it will have happened so many times in so many situations, little incidents, not just major, big moves, but little incidents. It will have already become your nature, that when the opportunity to drop everything and pour out your love for someone else's sake comes along, you naturally now just leap at it. It's just who you are, it's just what you do. There's no thought about the price that you have to pay. And I'll finish off today with this one statement that comes out of the Christian Gospels and Paul's writings, that it doesn't matter what you give for somebody else, God will always replenish you. God will always replace what you've given by something better or something more, always, because you're pouring God out into creation. You're pouring God out into another person's life. And in my ministry around the world, I was taught that over and over and over and over again. I'll just finish with one story from a lady. I was heading from San Francisco to Vermont. And from Vermont, I was heading down to Africa for my very first time alone in Kenya. And I was following up the work of another fellow who had been sent by God to go and do some mission work down there. I was following up his work. And I had $34 and something like 69 cents in my pocket. And I had been housed overnight by a woman in San Francisco who was house sitting a house. Eliana set it up for me. And so there I was, and I stayed overnight in this house. And in the morning we prayed, and this woman happened by chance, it accidentally came out that she was basically penniless. She was an artist, and artists have to get used to being penniless from time to time, if not most of the time. And so I fished into my pocket, and all the money I had, I didn't have anything in my bank account. All the money I had was $37 and a bunch of cents, and put this in her hand and said, "Here you go, off you go, have this. It'll at least let you buy some groceries today, and in God's hands, you might have someone else come along and feed you tomorrow." And then I caught my plane. Ticket was already bought, so Ron Wallace picked me up in Vermont. Now, I didn't know it really, but you needed $50 US cash to get your visa when you arrived in Nairobi airport in Kenya. I didn't know that, but I had not a cent when I arrived with Ron. And when I was there, I'd called Ron in the past and said, listen, when I come through there, what about I was just inspired by God. What about I run a workshop for people on something when I'm there? I'm arriving on the Thursday night into Vermont. How about I run a workshop there for people? They can arrive on Friday night, and we'll have Saturday and Sunday, and then Monday I'm flying out to Africa. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll call around. So I got there on Thursday night and met a couple of people. Mayor and Dave Tenney were there, and a couple of other people from around Vermont. By Friday night, there was quite a collection. Well, late in the night arrived the last of the people that we thought were going to be there. We started off in the morning at about 10 o'clock. Well, about 9 o'clock, this woman arrived in a car, and she'd driven up from Massachusetts. Well, a drive from Massachusetts to Vermont is, it's not like going around the corner. It's a distance. And she had heard from somebody just that morning that I was going to run a workshop. And she was moved by God. God said to her, go and do that thing, whatever this guy's doing, go and be there. So off she went. And she turned up, and I had there was no charge for the workshop. I never used to charge anything for workshops or anything like that. And she turned up there at about 9 o'clock, and we were just finishing off breakfast and a chat, and people were, as Americans do, sucking their last jug of coffee and and getting primed for the day. Anyway, she turns up and we greeted her, and nobody knew her at all. And she mentioned somebody, and somebody said, oh, yeah, you're a friend of so-and-so, aren't you? So, the bunch of grapes had been passed around a few times. And we did the workshop. Everyone stayed overnight in the cabin there, and then we continued on Sunday. And everyone was departing. There was no mention of money whatsoever and so on. Anyway, she wrote out a check for $1,000 for having attended, which is not an uncommon thing in America. Americans are incredibly generous and very loving people. Well, mind you, so is everybody given the opportunity. And Ron said, look, write the check out to me and I'll cash it in the morning and just get cash. So there it is. Ron's taking me to the airport. We stop by the bank. He pulls out $1,000 in US bills, and off I go. And I can't tell about the joy I had when I arrived in Nairobi airport to fish out a $50 bill and get my visa. And that money, I ended up back in New Zealand, I think, with maybe $1 or $2. But that money then got to feed orphans and pay for drivers to go to different places for the month that I spent in Nairobi out in the woolly wilds. And this is God's grace. And the love in that woman is such that there's no cost too much. And you'll find this in yourself, that if Christ calls you to do something, or God inside of you calls you to do something, you don't care the cost. You know that pouring out your love is worth more than anything else. And you give it freely. But if you're still gripped onto the world and you still haven't come across the basics of theosis, the renunciation of the world and the love of God, this combination exists as the foundation of your spiritual life, then of course you'll hold back your love. It'll be very, yeah, but what's it going to cost me? Well, for people like Evagrius, there is no cost too great. It doesn't matter. So this is the point of Evagrius. We've got another couple of sessions with Evagrius. We'll continue off next week and the week after. So greetings to you, Robert and Suzanne. Hope you found a great house today in Spain. And we'll love and leave you. Love you very much. God bless you all. Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Ciao.